Hi, Simon K. Jones here with the latest chapter of Tales from the Triverse. This is Gods and Robots, Part 6. Brulia, Palinor, 3208, Bright Sun, Dimming. 7 years old is an awkward, in-between age, caught between being an infant and being a young person. The world sees only a child, while the 7-year-old is torn between the simplicity of early years and the exciting promise of adulthood. Responsibility beckons, innocence calls out. Fleur found herself in that moment. Not quite this or that. Her days as an infant had not been simple nor innocent, being an Ainfa in a city-state that still heartily embraced slave contracts. She'd heard it called indentured servitude, but that was too hard to say and it sounded like the same thing anyway. No matter the label, it didn't change the facts. Her father whipped to death when she was 4. Her mother repeatedly beaten and abused by the lord of the house. Fleur had been left alone, but her mother seemed increasingly frantic with each passing year, as she'd grown a little taller, as if each inch was drawing her closer to a terrible fate she couldn't yet understand. The fighting had swept through the house, a man made of metal, cutting the guards to ribbons. She'd seen Lord Zaimdar sliced in half at the waist, his legs falling in the opposite direction to the rest of him. It had taken him another minute to die, flailing about on the floor, his guts unravelling. The horrible man calling for help, desperately trying to stuff himself back into his body with his fingers. Fleur had watched, the blood in the intestines, and the ragged meat searing into her brain, images that would never leave her, which would change who she was and how she saw the world. Memories burned permanently into place in her malleable and impressionable mind. She'd watched as the metal man had gone to the bookshelves and flicked through the pages of thick, dusty books that had not been touched in her lifetime. Her mother dragged her from the house and out onto the street. They had been hiding, avoiding the swords and the spells, but that was when it was only people being mean to each other. Now everyone was fighting the metal men and losing. Fleur and her mother darted down side streets, keeping away from the sounds of screaming and shouting and blades clashing, of explosions and fires and heavy things crashing to the ground. "We must get out of the city," said her mother, holding her hand tight, pulling her along. "But you said we should stay in the house." "That was before." They kept moving, away from the wide, smart streets where they had lived and worked. The city was unrecognisable, transformed to a battlefield, strewn with bodies and makeshift barricades and half-buildings, which seemed determined to stay standing despite their deep wounds. Staying out of sight was something Fleur had practised her entire life. When the streets were too dangerous, they leapt up to the rooftops and jumped from building to building. The metal men were everywhere, like the cockroaches in the cellar where she slept with her mother, stalking every street, moving in and out of houses, killing anyone who got in their way. Progress was excruciatingly slow, each street a potential route to death. Fleur kept quiet, allowing her mother to concentrate. She was clever, her mother, and would get them through it, like she always had. Up on the roof of a large house, creeping through a shaded garden terrace, Fleur caught movement somewhere in the distance and clutched at her mother's arm. "Look," she said, pointing at 24 warriors rising up from the city. Koth beating their massive wings, but also human wielders using levitation spells. They rose up and away from the streets towards the huge lump that hung awkwardly in the sky. "What are they doing?" Her mother frowned, squinting up into the blue, now sullied by dust and dark smoke. "Maybe they are trying to stop that monster. Kill it and it might stop the other creatures." "The metal men?" She nodded, and they hid by a bench and watched the daring group soar aloft, racing towards the floating thing. As they approached, the warriors broke formation, spreading apart, stretching the length of it. Fleur wondered what they were going to do, perhaps a massive coordinated spell, and then the Koth would fly in and tear the monster apart with their teeth and claws, and then it would be all over. She wished that she could be up there with them, casting spells and being a hero, so that the city would see her as more than a daughter of a slave. But she was Ainfa, and Ainfa couldn't do magic, and didn't have wings, so she had to settle for watching. There were flashes of light from some of the wielders, and plumes of fire and plasma from the Koth, forming a destructive wall that would have obliterated anything else. Instead, it spread out along the surface of the floating thing and faded away. A second passed, then another. The warriors moving around as dark specks, flies buzzing around a stinky animal. When the response came, it was definitive. An arcing wave spread from the hovering monster, emanating out on all sides, a huge orange wall of liquid fire that covered the sky, turning all of Brulia to a red hue as it blocked out the sun and the blue. It rushed out for miles, then dissipated into nothing, the city returning to its normal colours. The warriors were gone. Dropping back down to street level, her mother, even more determined for them to escape the city. It didn't take long to bump into more of the metal men. Rounding a corner, her mother abruptly stopped and tucked Fleur behind her, signalling for her not to move. "Where is Cainamor's journal?" The voice came from behind, and Fleur turned to find them surrounded. She squeezed her mother's hand. "I don't understand you," her mother said, pushing both of them up against a wall. "Have you seen any books?" One of the metal men came closer, seeming to look at Fleur, and her mother leaned in to whisper, "When I say so, run as fast as you can. I'll catch up." Reaching out a hand towards them, the metal man froze, then stood to attention. Peering around her mother, she saw that the other one had done the same. Neither were moving. Moving cautiously past them, Fleur and her mother turned the corner and found a similar scene on the next street, 6 of them standing immobile, human and Ainfar and Koth fighters standing around in a confused daze. High above, there was a thickening, a haze forming, as if a mist were gathering. As Fleur stared, she saw drops of water forming on the ground and jumping up into the air, and streams of liquid emerging from houses and moving in long undulating strands, snakes made of water. Nearby bodies of the fallen started to swell and bloat, then they burst all at once, blood and other liquids joining the great coagulation above the city. There were the cries of people in pain, and Fleur saw someone across the street clutching at their face, as liquids were pulled from their mouth and pores as their eyes burst, all contributing to the pool that was mixing together in a huge, hovering volume. It continued to grow, forming into an oblong shape, long and wide but not tall, a lake floating above the city. Then it lowered, slowly, deliberately, inexorably. The floating lake descended to the streets, where it simply settled, a 2-meter-high volume of water and other fluids. Fleur and her mother were another street away from where the lake had landed. As they watched, anyone caught inside the artificial volume began to drown, desperately attempting to reach the outer edge. Some swam and climbed steps and walls, emerging from the top edge of the lake. Anyone caught in the open had nowhere to go. All around, the day darkened, as if the sun was tired. The huge glob of water, which might have been 1/2 mile long, began to slowly shift its position in their direction. Fleur's mother pulled her away and they ran down the street, trying to stay ahead of the wall of water. Ahead there was a line of people blocking the way, seemingly unconcerned about the approaching water. "Hold your ground," shouted a large man, who looked like he was wearing a captain of the city guard's armour. "Wielders, elementalists, I want that water boiled away. Physiologists, maintain a protective bubble around us, in case this gets a little too close for comfort. Everyone else, see if you can identify the spell, counter it directly in some way. And you two," he pointed at Fleur and her mother, "get over here. We can protect you." They ran to the guards, and only then did Fleur notice that only some of them wore guard uniforms. At least half had the feathers and sashes of the Okehu, but for some reason they weren't fighting each other. One of the guards, a woman with a wonky face, smiled down at Fleur. "We'll look after you. Stay close." One of the Okehu looked nervous. "Rexon, why is it doing this?" "It's showing off," the captain shouted. "Experimenting. Well, we've been doing this a lot longer. Let's show it what we can do." Over half the group stepped forwards and began casting, whispering words and gesticulating with complex finger patterns. Fleur didn't know what any of it meant, but had always enjoyed watching wielders at work. As the wall of water approached, it began to deform and break apart, first at the corners, then in its core, losing form and sloshing onto the street, washing away into the sand. It clearly wasn't easy, but by the time the water reached them, it wasn't even above her ankles. The Brulian street was slick and bright with a layer of dirty water, as if a flood had just passed through, not an event ever seen on the mazes. "Good work, everyone," the captain shouted. "Stay alert. We don't know what it will try next. It seems to be learning new techniques." They were stood in a lush jungle, the buildings all gone. Trees surrounded them on all sides, while strange creatures swung through the branches and slid down vines. Then they were stood on a mountain's peak, snow on the ground. Fleur had never seen such a place with her own eyes. They sailed on a boat down a wide river, birds flying overhead. "Visualization!" shouted one of the city guard. "Can someone please break it?" The captain stormed about the deck. "We're not here on holiday." The boat splintered, the river cracked, and they were back on the street in Brulia. Fleur squeezed her mother's hand. "What is happening?" "I don't want another mass hallucination hitting us," the captain shouted. "Watch out for lazy tricks and get us free as soon as they manifest, understood?" The other guards nodded firmly. The captain looked up at the thing in the sky. "What next, you vicious son of a bitch?" They all stood in the street, Fleur huddled beneath her mother's arm. She wished she could go back to the previous day, when everything had been normal. Living in Lord Zaimdar's house was awful, but this was worse, and much scarier. One of the Akehu fighters, an archer, disintegrated. There was no warning, no crying out in alarm. They simply fell apart, and fell to the ground as a pile of dust, some of them drifting away on the wind. They all jumped back, including the captain. "Another illusion?" "No, sir, this is not visualist magic." The woman with the funny face spoke up. "It's micrology, cellular grinding. I've read about it." One of the city guard, a man holding a large shield and pike, vanished to dust, leaving behind his armour and weapons. "Where are my micrologists?" the captain bellowed. "I need a solution, now." "Countering now," said an Akehu, who was then joined by a guard. "We can employ a stasis technique to maintain coherence, but it won't last forever. And this is happening across the city. I can feel it." Their faces were fixed with concentration, beads of sweat forming. "Do what you can," the captain said. "Leave the rest to us." "Mummy," Fleur said, "why is all this happening?" "I don't know. These people are helping us. I won't let anything happen to you." It began as an itch, a strange tickle on her scalp, and then a headache, sudden and piercing. Fleur dropped to her knees, clutching at her head. Her right fist cramped, her thumb pinned to her palm, then the muscles in her right arm contracted and she found herself unable to move it away from her chest. She looked to her mother for help, but her face was a similar expression of pain and confusion. Hands seized Fleur and pulled her away. It was the woman with the wonky face. She could hear the captain shouting orders, and through the pain saw the guards fighting the Akehu, but clumsily, as if they were puppets in a marionette show. Her mother slouched towards them, dragging one heel, violence in her eyes. One of the city guards put their hands around Fleur's face and whispered something. Then the fog cleared and the headache subsided. "It's playing with our minds," the captain was shouting. "Don't let it." "You'll be okay," the female guard said, smiling weakly as her comrade treated Fleur's mother. Even as the murderous expression faded, Fleur found herself backing away, tucking in behind the guard. Her mother was repeating her name over and over, an apology of sorts. "What is happening?" "The ship is moving through magic disciplines," the woman with the face said. "We're trying to adapt, but we've not seen anything like it. That last attack was a puppetry micrology spell. It's hard to do to one person, let alone half a city." "This is happening to the whole city, not just us?" The captain was shouting orders again. "Everyone off the street. It might be targeting us because it can see us." There was a series of sucking pops, the air around the captain seeming to pucker and flex, and one of his arms exploded. Another pop, and his legs were reduced to pins, as if instantaneously crushed. He flopped to the ground, grunting. Holding out his remaining hand, he beckoned to the woman with the droopy face. Fleur was still at her side, still eyeing her mother suspiciously. "We can't fight it," the captain said, speaking through clearly immense pain, his teeth clenched between each word. "Order an evacuation. Get as many out of the city as you can." He grabbed at her with his remaining hand. "Gina, Go to the palace, find Princess Darla. They're looking for Chancellor Baltine. He might have answers." "Captain Rexon," said the woman, Gina. Fleur could hear the distress in her voice. She couldn't stop staring at the man's ruined arm and legs, the wounds extending far into his torso. One side of his chest looked to be crushed, his breathing ragged, flecks of blood covered his lips. "Gina," he said, pulling her closer. "You know what to do." Fleur watched as Gina plunged an icicle into Captain Rexon's chest, and his writhing finally ceased. Reaching up, Fleur squeezed Gina's hand, just like her mother would squeeze hers. Then she turned back to her mother, who was sat on the ground, staring at nothing. To Fleur the world was forever changed, and the life she'd had only a day earlier seemed so distant it may as well have been a dream. There was nothing now but fighting, and blood, and war. First a layer of dust, then pebbles, then Fleur herself, all of them lifting from the ground. It was her mother too, and Gina and the guards. They were all floating, ascending, along with barricades and carts and barrels, anything not nailed down. A dead horse bumped against a string of bunting, spread between two buildings, becoming entangled. Up they went, another impossible, inexplicable torture, up to the rooftops, and then they kept going. The street dropped away, and then Fleur could see across the city where there were hundreds of people, stretching to the edge of the mazer, all being drawn up into the sky. "Local gravity warp," shouted one of the surviving Akehu. "But I've never seen one this big." Scrabbling at nothing but air, Fleur tumbled as she ascended, finding herself upside down and facing her mother, who reached out with both arms. Fleur stretched as much as she could, but they had drifted apart, her mother just too far to touch. Up they went, half of the city, all the Ainfa and Koth and humans, all the dogs and other animals, all the market stalls and fresh meat and fruit and bread, chairs and tables, discarded weapons, the roofs of some buildings, all of it, rising 20 meters, then 50, then more. Even higher above sat the long, thick, dark object, the flying monster that was causing all the trouble. It hovered in place as if suspended on strings, perfectly still, no movement or expression across its surface. There was only empty space below Fleur, empty space all the way down to the streets splayed out far below. She'd never been in an airship, and had always wondered what it must be like for Koth. There was something serene about being there with all those other people, tumbling in the late afternoon. The sky had turned an odd purple colour, despite the sun being well above the horizon. She found she could look at the sun without it being uncomfortable for her eyes. That was weird. Gravity flipped, returning to its standard orientation, and she fell. They all fell, tumbling end over end, picking up speed as they plummeted towards the ground. As she spun, Fleur caught glimpses of Koth, flying in zigzag patterns, like bats and birds, hunting bugs in the evening sky, and she realized they were trying to catch people out of the air. She wondered if anyone would catch her. There was a streak of movement, and Fleur saw Gina be snatched away. The ground was coming close now, rushing up to say hello. Fleur wondered if it would hurt. Probably not. Just a big, quick splat. The streak returned and thumped into her, and then she was in the thick arms of a Koth, buffeted by the air, swooping in a huge arc to slow down, and then coming to a rough landing. The Koth put her and Gina down gently and smiled, their big teeth flashing. "Gina," they said, then turned to Fleur. "Hello, little one. You are under my protection now." "Lycazra," Gina said, breathing heavily, gasping. "We thought you were dead." "Nearly. We should find cover. That Max Earth abomination hasn't killed us all yet, so it'll probably keep trying." Gina nodded. "It's like it's going through the early spells we all learn at the academy, but on a huge, uncontrolled scale." She looked down at her feet. "Captain Rexon is dead." The big Koth snorted, a flicker of fire in the corners of her mouth. "Then let's make sure he didn't die for nothing." Taking hold of Fleur's hand, Lycazra led her and Gina towards an abandoned building. Fleur couldn't help but marvel at the size of the Koth's hand, which was bigger than her entire head. Holding it reminded her. "Wait," she said. "My mother. We have to find her." The Koth paused, then glanced at Gina. There was an exchange there, a knowing, silent, communication, and Fleur understood immediately. Her mother was dead. Nobody caught her. "We'll look for her once it is safe," Lycasra said. They entered through the splintered front door into the darkness of what had once been a shop, which is when the 3 floors of the building concertinaed down on top of them. Walking only 3 steps behind Lycasra and the little girl was enough to save Gina. The concussive force of the collapse knocked her off her feet, and she scrabbled backwards to get clear as masonry and stones smashed into the ground. Through the spreading dust cloud she saw that it wasn't an isolated incident. Every building on the street, and for as far as she could see, had been flattened. Another spell from the megaship. It had only arrived an hour, perhaps 2 earlier. Was it even that long? She had lost track. Regardless, it had overwhelmed the combined forces of the city guard and the Okehu, had killed hundreds, probably thousands, including Rexon. It felt like the end of the world. Her eyes were full of dirt and grit, and her mouth tasted of ash. Looking down at herself, she was a ghost, a pale, dusted version of Gina, as if someone had rolled her in flour. Clearing the rubble was impossible, its weight far too much for her to lift or move. There was nobody around to help, only bodies, and a couple of staggering figures further down the street. A great hand had reached out and flattened Brulia. Surviving the building's collapse was unlikely. Living long enough to be rescued was impossible. Gina slumped to the ground, her body shaking, wanting to somehow find herself beneath the debris, so as to at least have an end of it. No. Rexon had given her orders. Every joint, every muscle aching, her vision smeared and blood in her mouth, she forced herself to her feet. Orienting in the ruined district was not simple, but she could still navigate by the position of the sun and the mountains in the far distance. The palace was her destination. Then, as if someone had snuffed out a candle, the sun went dark. Thanks for listening. That was a long one. I hope you, maybe not enjoyed that. That was pretty grim. You can leave comments over at simonkjones.substack.com, where you can also subscribe and find behind-the-scenes notes and all of that good stuff. Thank you for listening.